So happy Friday, everyone. Happy Ignite Week. My name is Laura Hunter. I am an identity and access management architect within Microsoft's internal IT department. And so what does that mean, really? So you think of Microsoft as a software company, as a cloud services company, and we are all of those things. But we're also, at the end of the day, a Fortune 100 organization with 250,000 employees and lots of different constituencies of full-time employees and vendors and business guests and business partners and lots of people who come into work every day and who just want their stuff to work. And that's where Microsoft IT comes in. Now, my team specifically is the Identity and Access Management team, which means that most of you have been talking to folks like Nazos, folks like David Howell, folks like Steve Dispenza, down on the booth this week, talking about Active Directory and Federation services and Azure AD and Azure AD Premium, and they're telling you about all these cool things they're building. I get to deploy them inside of Microsoft IT before any of y'all even see them, which is a whole lot of fun because, on the one hand, we are, MSIT is, Microsoft's first and best customer. We always want to be the first and best customer for all of our engineering groups so that we can provide early feedback, early testing, early burn-in of our products so that by the time they get out to the general public, we make them as good and as enterprise ready and as robust as we can. But at the end of the day, once again, I'm still a Fortune 100 business and I still have a Fortune 100 business to run. I got FISMA compliance to deal with. I got SOX compliance to deal with. I even got some PCI running around now that we have a retail group. So any compliance three-letter acronym alphabet, it's running around somewhere in my organization. And so there's always this sort of concern, there's always this sort of question of how do we, as an IT organization, balance this notion of rapid product adoption with maintaining a secure and robust environment. And every once in a while, we get to do both at the same time. And that's when my job gets really, really cool. So IT, Microsoft IT, Microsoft as an organization, unsurprisingly, we are a big, highly mobile, highly diverse workforce. We have sales offices and sales and services presences on 6 out of 7 continents. When we open the services office in Antarctica, I am volunteering to open up that office just because I really want to go. Oh, goodness. What else can I tell you? 7.9 million link calls every month. Federated BI portfolio for 1,000 applications. I can even top that. I can tell you that my internal ADFS infrastructure, my Federation services infrastructure, as of today has 7,000 federated applications attached to it. Now you look at that number and you go, oh my gosh, how can you possibly do that? How did you allow that to happen? Please do remember that I support software developers kind of as part of my job. And so lots and lots of those applications are hello worlds. Lots and lots of those applications are the dev who wanted to figure out how SAML worked and how federated auth worked, and he wanted to do so by getting single sign-on with his corporate creds. The world is well and truly greeted by my Federation infrastructure. But this just gives you sort of an idea of what Microsoft IT as an organization looks like and what it looks like to run the business of being Microsoft and to be in the business of providing IT services for Microsoft. Because we are a Fortune 100 with all of the fiscal and compliance responsibilities that come along with that, but we're also a company that builds software. So we want to move fast and we want to be innovative and we want to provide all of our employees with the tools and the services that they need and that they're looking for to be able to have a great experience, access the services that they need, be able to go forth and innovate and build cool stuff so that my stock prices go up. I'm renovating my house. This is very important to me right now. So this is kind of the one, the one side of the scale. But on the other side of the scale, we still need to secure our environment. We still need to be sure that the business of being Microsoft, all of our data, all of our intellectual property, all of our core services are still secure and are still being maintained in that secure fashion while providing that user experience that is great that enables our end users across whatever device they want to work on, across whatever applications, whatever services that they're trying to access, whether those services are on premises, whether those services are up in the cloud. So, cloud adoption inside of Microsoft. Probably surprises no one in this room that we are relatively far along on our path to cloud adoption. I think it was back in 2009 that our friend Mr. Ballmer stood up in front of a room full of people at the University of Washington and uttered those immortal words, "Microsoft is all into the cloud." Big press event. Microsoft, we're all in. Bunch of IT people sitting back at the office watching this event over webcast, and we sit back and we listen and we say, okay, we're all in. Do you know what that means? Bob, do you guys have any idea what that means? We had to go figure out what that meant. And kind of one of the things we figured out very quickly as we began our road to cloud adoption is that all roads kind of lead to identity. So if you've seen any of Nazos's presentations or in any of the other hybrid identity sessions this week, the phrase that you've heard is identity is the control plane. And I swear I'm going to start charging them for royalties because I've been saying that since 2010. What I've actually been saying is identity is the security boundary of the cloud. So it used to be, back in the on-prem world, what were your security controls? How were you securing your environments? You based a lot of your security decisions and a lot of your security controls on the assumption that you controlled the servers, that you controlled the network, that you controlled the infrastructure. And you had this big monster mammoth $100,000 firewall sitting at your border. Well, once you start moving things to the cloud, once you start adopting software as a service, once you start moving to platform as a service, even infrastructure as a service, you start looking at how those controls need to evolve and how you as a company can evolve your security controls but also your operational and your internal processes to be able to adopt cloud services. And it kind of all starts with identity. Specifically, it starts with, at least for Microsoft IT certainly, for us it started with on-premises identity management, which is to say we've been around for 40 years now. We kind of had a lot of systems and a lot of infrastructure very well built out before this cloud thing ever happened. And one of those pieces was on-premises identity management. User account provisioning, lifecycle management, deprovisioning, all of these things were very much in place and very well entrenched before we ever started moving towards cloud adoption. And this ended up serving us incredibly well when we started moving towards adoption of services like Office 365, because we already had systems in place that allowed us to create a compilation, if you will, of authoritative identity data that we were pulling from a number of different sources. Now, our primary source for identity data, our authoritative source for identity data, much like many of you, I'm sure, is our human resources system. That's where all of the hire and fire events take place. That's where all of the different changer type events take place. Someone gets promoted, someone moves to a different department. All of that is sourced from our human resources system. But that's not the only place that our data comes from. That's not the only place that authoritative data comes from. We have some information that is authoritatively sourced from our applications. Our Exchange servers, for example, are the authoritative source for our email addresses. Other systems, for example, we have line of business applications that become the authoritative source for things like your expense approval limits. You are a senior director, therefore you can approve expense reports up to X amount of dollars. We call that our safe limit. Laura has no safe limit, Laura needs no safe limit. But this becomes something that when we start moving to the cloud, hey, when we start moving our expense reporting systems from on-prem to the cloud, where is that data now coming from? Used to be you would just, the application server was sitting on-prem. It would go make a SQL call to that SQL server that it knew was sitting on-prem. What do we do now? We want to move that to Azure IaaS. We want to move that to Azure PaaS. We may eventually want to move it into a commoditized software as a service offering. How do we do that? And so when we started this journey, when we started moving to the cloud, used to be when we would talk about application development and when we would talk about adopting services within IT, we had a phrase, and that phrase was, every application needs to do two things. It needs to know who you are, and it needs to know what you can do, that being authentication and authorization. When we started moving to the cloud, we realized that we had forgotten a step. And the reason we had forgotten that step is because we were taking it for granted. The step we were forgetting was that one in the middle, which is any application that you interact with, 99 times out of 100, needs to give you the ability to interact with other users in the system. Exchange has a global address list. SharePoint has a people picker. We always took this for granted because when our applications were on-prem, Active Directory gave this to us for free. You domain joined your Exchange servers to on-prem AD, you domain joined your SharePoint servers, or if they were sitting in your extranet and they weren't domain joined, they were making LDAP calls to an endpoint that you exposed to them. And effectively, we got all this for free. How do I take that pre-existing assumption that when we were sitting on-prem just plain worked, and how do I move that into the cloud? How do I move my directory or the ability for users to interact with other users within a system? How do I move that into a cloud-based world? We start with authentication. Start with the first one. Unsurprisingly, Microsoft IT, from an authentication perspective, we're a big Active Directory shop on-prem. We have 9, forgot Nokia. We have 9 Active Directory forests on-prem and 22 on-premises domains. So big old complex on-prem environment. How do we extend our existing authentication services into the cloud? We started with Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. We started with ADFS back when it first shipped, back in Server 2003 R2, back in the 2005 timeframe, back when all it supported was WS Federation. The running joke at that point was all dressed up and no one to federate with. In 2006, I think we had 40 federated relying parties associated with our ADFS infrastructure. Today, as I mentioned, we have well over 7,000. The world moves on. We want to update our systems. We want to, take advantage of new services, new functionality, new features. Kind of the big thing that we're working on now, that we're looking to be working on probably within the next year, 18 months-ish, roughly. Ask me back next year, I'll tell you how it's going, is moving from this ADFS Federation Services model, where I have these thousands and thousands of point-to-point relationships with all of these individual applications, where once every 2 years I've got to update that token signing cert, or if a URL changes, I got to go in and update that. I've got ADFS engineers who are really invested in PowerShell, and they've got it down to a science. And it's cool that they've got it down to a science, but I'd still kind of like to get them out of the business of doing that if I can. And so one of the things that we're working on is transitioning our federation infrastructure from on-prem ADFS, being the focal point and the hub of our federation infrastructure. We're looking at moving that, transitioning that to Azure Active Directory as the federation hub. From an IT perspective, from MSIT as customer, this greatly simplifies our on-premises infrastructure. Specifically, it greatly simplifies how we manage our on-prem infrastructure. Because eventually, once this is all done, I don't have 7,000 relying parties to manage. I've got, well, one big one, Azure AD. I'm sure I'll have a couple more, but rounding off for small numbers, I'll have less than a dozen. That's a heck of a lot better than 7,000, any which way you slice it. The transition to Azure AD also allows us to do things we couldn't do before. We have new functionality that's being lit up around cross-organizational communication, cross-organizational trusts that was possible with on-prem ADFS, but was a lot harder. If I wanted to do federated single sign-on with my business partners, with the end manufacturers with whom every time we run a new version of Windows, we want to send them specs, we want to give them access to our SharePoint sites, That again became a point-to-point federation relationship with all of these federation partners, dozens and dozens and dozens of federation partners. And that assumed a certain amount of infrastructure readiness on the part of the partner. I'm running ADFS, you're running ADFS, maybe you're not running ADFS, maybe you're running ping, maybe you're running CA SiteMinder. Point is, you're running something. And there's an IT person on the other end of that relationship who is sufficiently well versed to set up that point-to-point relationship. Okay, now I've done that for one partner, now I have to do it for 37 others. By transitioning to by transitioning to Azure AD as the federation hub, this starts getting a lot easier. I start just getting a bunch of stuff for free. If I'm federated, if I have a presence in AAD and your organization has a presence in AAD, well, guess what? Auth is pretty much solved. Yay, I can go open a bar. I'm telling you, I've got it. Back to the directory. So how do we extend our directory to the cloud? There's kind of two main ways that you can extend your directory from on-prem into Azure Active Directory. I've shown you both examples on this slide. Just for point of reference, if you're looking at the slides later, MSIT is the one on the bottom, not the one on the top. And what I mean by that is there's kind of two different ways to do it. You can extend your directory to the cloud by way of identity synchronization using FIM, MIM, AAD Connect, and then use ADFS as your authentication broker for your on-premises identities. And so that's the way that, that is the way that MSIT does it. And one of the reasons that we do this is that we already had ADFS in place by the time Azure AD came along. Azure AD is a very important relying party for us, don't get me wrong, but they are one relying party out of 7,000. I would say they were probably the 3,120th, which is a little scary if you think about it. I gave you the top one as kind of a point of reference just because it's a different way of solving the problem. It's a different way of looking at the problem of how do you extend auth and your directory into the cloud. And that is that you can use Identity Sync, you can use FIM, MIM, AAD Connect, and you can synchronize your directory into the cloud. And you can, while you're synchronizing your directory, you can also synchronize your password hashes, which eliminates the need for you to run a federation service on your existing prem. Now, the reason this is interesting and the reason that I point this out is because you don't necessarily need to do an either-or, which is to say, if you have services running in the cloud that require you to have your password hashes sitting in the cloud, you can configure a subset of your user base to use password hashes while the rest of your user base uses federation, or vice versa. You can also switch from one to the other and then back again. If your ADFS service on-prem just craters, like you lose a data center, you have the ability within Azure Active Directory, there's an article on TechNet, it's like 28 steps, I recommend you read the whole thing. You have the ability to transition from a federated tenancy to a password hash tenancy, and then flip back when you're done. Again, kind of a longish article, I recommend you read the whole thing. But you do have that ability and that flexibility that you don't necessarily need to choose one or the other, which is pretty cool. Kind of talk about the last one, talk about entitlements. This is kind of an up and coming area for us. This is a lot of the stuff that David and Alex were talking about in the previous hour, and this is really exciting stuff for me because one of the major benefits for us of Azure Active Directory is that it starts lighting up services for us that we never used to be able to provide before. So, for example, allowing our people to do self-service group management in an internet-facing way. We have self-service group management on-prem today by way of Forefront Identity Manager. However, the cloud-based service offering makes that a lot simpler for us, gives us a lot less infrastructure to manage. It's very cool. Allowing different subsets of our users to edit their profile information. So for example, my content marketing group that manages all of the Microsoft social media assets, they have a large number of short-term vendors, like someone will come in for a period of weeks to manage the @Windows Azure Twitter account, and this person's here for like 3 weeks, and then that person rolls off and another person rolls on. I would love to be able to put the business owner within my CMG group, I would love to be able to give them the ability to maybe manage those vendors' identities rather than always necessarily needing to go through these massive, human resources processes. So, kind of cool stuff. And this just kind of gives you an idea of, as an evolution, if you will, of the Microsoft IT identity management roadmap, this kind of shows how we're thinking of moving forward from a very, very completely on-prem infrastructure to starting to get into the cloud, starting to make little inroads into the cloud, to how far can we go and how fast can we get there. Like I could envision a future state where I could look at an entire business unit within Microsoft, and let's, don't even talk about technology, talk about business process. If I have an entire business unit within Microsoft where they have 5 job roles, and I take one of every 5, and I follow them around for the course of the day, and I say, hey guys, what systems are you accessing? And let's start taking an inventory. What systems are you accessing? Well, I'm accessing SharePoint Online. Well, I'm accessing Exchange Online. Well, I'm accessing Lync Online and Visual Studio Online. And if I get to the end of the day and not a one of those people has accessed a single on-prem system, maybe their identities don't need to be on-prem. Maybe I can start thinking about transitioning to cloud-only identity. I don't think it'll happen overnight. I don't think it'll happen, full bore big bang. We're still a 250,000 user enterprise, but we do have these opportunities to start taking advantage of all of this stuff that my friends Nazos and Mr. Howell and Mr. Dispenza are building for me out in the cloud. It's really exciting. So that's what's exciting. Now let's talk about what keeps me awake at night. Do you ever have one of those conference calls and you get the invitation for the conference call and you look at it and you say, this is either going to be really good or really bad? Yeah, when that one happened, there kind of was no good. Yeah, there was no good about that. Like, that was not going to be a good meeting. This was also not going to be a good meeting. When you get a phone call at 9 a.m. on Christmas Day saying, can you be on a conference call in 30 minutes, and you get on that call and there's 2 presidents on the line. Ooh, well, that's fun. And it's not as though we didn't realize that this whole cloud security thing was important before. I mean, come on, Mark Russinovich works for us. We kind of know what we're doing here. But it created this interesting, I'll call it an opportunity, by which Microsoft IT, specifically our security arm, could take a look at how we were enabling, how we were providing cloud services, and look at how we could very quickly, very quickly ramp up the security posture of our cloud services while still trying to provide that good user experience, while still providing an experience for our internal users that allowed them to do their jobs. And so this opened up a little bit of debate. You had the security guys sitting in the room saying, well, if we want to secure everything, that's easy. Just make everyone use smart cards for everything at all times. Laura, can you turn this on tomorrow? No exaggeration. I was literally asked on Christmas Day, Laura, can you enforce smart card off for all of our cloud services tomorrow? Luckily, cooler heads prevailed. Those cooler heads pointing out things like, you realize we support software developers, right? We support like really smart technical people, right? And if you put too many roadblocks in their way, they're going to get around us in ways you're going to wish they hadn't. I would actually submit that the really technical part of that sentence, doesn't even matter anymore. Look at the software as a services market. You can pick up a credit card and swipe your credit card, and boom, you've got an internet-facing file sharing service that some department of yours has signed up for that IT has no knowledge of. You know, you don't even need to be technical anymore to get around IT. Hence things like Cloud App Discovery, which is like totally awesome for us. So we had to kind of make that balance between how can we rapidly expand our security posture, but still do so intelligently. And part of that intelligence was, how do we support all of these different device types? How do we support all these different device types that people are now working from? We now have, you know, very, very active work and very active development around building apps for iOS, building, you know, apps for Android. I've got tons and tons of people in my operating systems group who walk around every day with a MacBook and they never touch a Windows device anymore. If you told me this 5 years ago, I would have thought you were on crack. But it's just really, it's really fun to watch. But it does put an interesting spin on the security discussion, because back to the security guys saying, hey, let's just do, you know, smart card logins everywhere. Anybody get an iPad? Where do you plug a smart card reader into? We actually learned this lesson 2 years ago. And we learned this lesson 2 years ago when there was this big, hey, everyone gets a new Windows 8 PC, you know, within Microsoft. It was like a big announcement at the company meeting, and everyone got these really shiny new Windows 8 PCs. We got these gorgeous laptops in, and tens of thousands of them shipped without smart card readers. What are we going to do now? So, you know, these are things that we have to figure out how we're going to provide secure access to our services while still providing the ability for people to not have to carry smart card readers around with them, like the one that's taped onto this desk, which I think is so cool. It's sitting there and like blinking at me. It's so funny. And it's not just about technology either. It's about human processes. So back to the smart cards. Every FTE, every full-time employee at Microsoft gets a smart card. And we use them for high security operations. We use them for things like code signing. We use them for things like issuing SSL certificates for a public-facing website so that you can make that request. How do we issue these smart cards? What's the process for issuing a smart card? If you're a new employee, you get one issued to you at new employee orientation. Great. That's why everyone's photo is like 27 years old. You walk into a Microsoft building. You present your driver's license, your passport, you get your picture taken, you pick a pin, you walk out with your smart card. Great. Works really well if you live within a 35-mile radius of Seattle, Washington. Very large, very mobile workforce, sales and services presence on 6 out of 7 continents. What happens for them? We have remote issuance offices in a number of our different locations. Chicago is actually one of them. You can walk into the Microsoft office in Chicago, and there are staff there who will issue you a smart card. And we have these all over the world, but not enough of them, I think. Which is to say, we have entire continents where we have Microsoft staff and no DIO. Okay, we'll mail it to your address of record. If you live somewhere where it's not convenient for you to get to a DIO, we'll mail it to your address of record. But what about my people who are traveling? What about my people who are paid to travel 4.5 days out of the week for Microsoft, who come home on the weekends and say, who are these people who live in my house? Psst, that's your family. What do I do for these people? How do I get them? How do I enable them to do their jobs? How do I enable them to be able to be secure and access the resources they need from the devices that they want? Does this process still make sense in 2015, given all of the implications of the different device types and the big mobile complex workforce? Does this process still make sense? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think the point being, there's got to be a better way to do it. So how do we make strong auth easier? Because if you make strong authentication easier, if you make it more accessible to your user base, you can apply it more broadly. You usually think of the security analogy where there's the big dial, and there's usability on one side, and there's security on the other, and if you dial the one down, the other one goes up, and the one goes up, the other goes down. What we need, and what we found with multi-factor auth, with Azure multi-factor authentication, is the ability to make security more accessible to our end users which then allowed us to enforce it more broadly. Rising tide, raising all ships. It's a really cool thing. What multi-factor auth does for us, has anyone seen this in action this week, by the way? Anyone seen any demos of, yay, lots of hands going up. I love this service, makes me so happy. Did not do a demo of this service because, well, doing a demo of a service that requires both internet access and phone service, no, I'm not that brave. Other people are. Nazos is that brave. He does it all the time. He's a rock star. But what's multi-factor auth do for us? It allows us to provide for strong authentication for form factors that wouldn't otherwise support it. It allows us to enable strong authentication on form factors that don't support a physical smart card. Things like your iPads, things like your mobile devices. And it allows us to do so in a way that lets us enforce strong authentication requirements far more broadly. So where did we start? How does it look today? We apply, from a technology perspective, we apply a multi-factor authentication policy on our relying party trust relationship between ADFS and Azure Active Directory. You see the little red dot, the 2FA policy applies there. And this applies 2FA policy to all of my Azure AD, all of my O365 properties. So SharePoint Online, Outlook Web Access, Visual Studio Online. The way that we have enforced this and the policy that we've chosen to enforce is that we have chosen to enforce MFA from the internet for all O365 and Azure AD services. So if you are sitting on CorpNet, we will allow you to do 1FA because the assumption is you had to badge into the building. So access to secure prem implies strong authentication. So if you're sitting on-prem, we allow you to do 1FA except for high security operations. So 1FA default, step-up authentication for higher security operations. Even if you're sitting on-prem, I'm going to prompt you for 2FA if you're going to do code signing. And I think you're all happy that I do. If you're coming in from the internet, if you're sitting at a Starbucks, if you're sitting at home, the opposite applies. By default, I'm going to prompt you to multi-factor auth to all of my O365 services. I will only allow one-factor auth on an exception basis. And one of the reasons I really love Azure multi-factor auth is that it allows me to take all of these exceptions that I used to have and start whittling down, whittling down, whittling down, whittling down. Prior to Azure MFA, prior to having the ability to do mobile phone as smart card effectively, prior to Azure MFA, I had entire business units that had a one-factor auth exception for remote access because I couldn't technically enforce it. My entire Mac business unit, we build Mac Office. I think Microsoft is the 6th largest creator of Macintosh software on the planet. My entire Mac business unit had a 1FA exception because they had to, because it was the only way they could do their jobs. Well, hey, now there's multi-factor auth. Now I have the ability, again, because I've made 2FA easier, because I've made 2FA more accessible, I now have the ability to enforce it more broadly and to start whittling down on some of these 2FA exceptions that have previously kept me awake at night. But this isn't perfect. This is, this is not a perfect mechanism, and it's not. And I think you all can look at the slide and realize why it's imperfect. It's not yet granular enough. But we're fixing that, which is to say that we are introducing the ability to apply multi-factor auth policy on a more granular basis. We can start accessing it on the basis of, we can start enforcing it on the basis of workload. I can apply MFA for SharePoint Online, but I can choose not to apply MFA to my company portal, for example, because number one, my company portal is a list of apps, and also from a usability perspective, 9 times out of 10, someone is accessing my company portal from their mobile device. And just from a form factor perspective, at that point, I'm going to err on the side of usability. But my SharePoint sites, Visual Studio Online, my source code, oh, you're darn skippy. You're darn skippy, I'm going to MFA those. And what we don't yet have, and what we're working with the different engineering groups to be able to enforce sometime in the great by and by, is to start enforcing this and is to start incorporating this with our existing governance processes, our existing data management processes. Wouldn't it be great if I could create a policy that says 2FA required for all of my HBI SharePoint sites, but LBI, I'll give you a pass. Wouldn't it be great if I could do that? Can't do that today. Probably can't do that tomorrow. That's going to be a great day when I can do that, though. Things that we've learned. Things that we've learned about deploying Azure multi-factor auth. Kind of the most important thing that we learned is that policy matters as much, if not more than, security. And here's kind of the biggest example of that. When you deploy Azure multi-factor auth, and there's two different flavors of multi-factor auth, by the way. There's an on-prem version and there's a cloud service version. Everything I'm talking about pretty much applies equally to both. There's some specific technical nuances. If you have questions about that, we can talk about it later. But generally speaking, everything I'm talking about here applies equally to the on-prem and to the cloud flavors of Azure MFA. So policy matters. And that's to say, when you first deploy Azure MFA, there is an out-of-the-box enrollment experience. And that out-of-box enrollment experience allows you to enroll your phone number, so enter your phone number in for use by Azure MFA, on the basis of a username and password. Now, if you are an organization that doesn't already have strong authentication in place, this is still a good deal. Because at that point, today you have passwords. Tomorrow you can have phones. And that's better. For an enterprise organization like Microsoft, we actually had to approach it from the opposite perspective. Today, I have physical smart cards, and I have policies and processes associated with how I issue my physical smart cards. Some of those policies and processes are taken into account for my different governance obligations, things like my FISMA audits, things like my SOX compliance, things like that. We'll look at, hey, Microsoft IT, are you adhering to the policies that you say you're adhering to as regards issuance of strong authentication credentials? So had to figure out, when I was introducing this new authentication type, how was I going to do that? Now, if all I cared about was usability, I would have taken the out-of-box portal, click, 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 done. Everyone enrolls for Azure MFA on the basis of the username and password. Took me 5 minutes to set up. I go home happy. But I can't do that. If all I cared about was security, I could have solved the problem in about 5 minutes more than that, which is to say I would have taken that out-of-box portal and I would have published it. I would have published it behind some sort of trunk that required smart card auth. Everyone issues their enrolls for Azure MFA on the basis of their physical smart card. Everything chains back to that strongly proofed credential, maybe an additional 5 minutes, and I'm done. But I had to care about both. I had to provide for strong issuance and strong identity assurance of my Azure MFA credentials while still providing the usability and while still providing the ability for my folks on my MacBooks and my folks on my iOS devices to be able to enroll for this service. And sometimes that ends up meaning that you fill technical gaps. So in the Azure MFA service as it exists today, I didn't have a way to accommodate both needs. I could have gone username and password. I could have gone physical smart card. I didn't have anything that accounted for both user experience as well as security requirements. So what did I do? I built a custom enrollment portal. I built a custom enrollment portal that allowed users to enroll for Azure MFA, so to enter their phone number information. I built a portal that allowed users to enroll for Azure MFA either using their smart card. If you've got your smart card, great, swipe it, put in your PIN, put in your phone number, click next, you're done. If you don't have a smart card, if you're out in the field and you've allowed it to expire and having trouble getting a new one, if you're on a device type that doesn't allow for the use of physical smart card, you can still enroll for this service. Basically, we've put a workflow in place that it challenges your email address, like it sends a one-time link to your email address, one of those, hey, click on this, it's going to expire in an hour, kind of that very familiar paradigm. So we challenge your email address, we challenge the phone, we send a one-way SMS to your phone so that it provides a challenge of the possession of the phone, and then we use the manager, we use the user's manager, we use a manager approval in lieu of a physical smart card. And so effectively we use second actor in lieu of physical smart card. Now that some of you are sitting back going, yeah, but don't the managers just go, yeah, approve, whatever, I don't care? They actually don't. The reason that this works for us, and again, this is a Microsoft IT solution, this may or may not work for your individual organizations, the reason that manager approval works for us is a function of corporate culture. We are a very large, very matrixed organization. The only way that we can survive organizationally is to push a lot of authority and thus a lot of faith onto our people managers. Our people managers approve expense reports. Our people managers approve remote access requests for the vendors that they hire. We very much instill, from a corporate culture perspective, we very much instill onto our managers, we are giving you a lot of responsibility. Essentially, we are giving you the ability to mess up the company. Please don't do it, because you guys are shareholders as much as we are. I can fill out an expense report that's 27.5 pages long. If I miss one receipt, my manager sends it back to me. Our managers take this stuff seriously. And this is why, from a cultural perspective and from a human perspective, in addition to the technology, this is why this works for us. Will it work for you? That's the kind of question that you need to think about, the kind of question you need to answer. Back to the technology, though, because that's the fun part. Things that we learned while we were deploying Azure Multi-Factor Auth. So Multi-Factor Auth came along, and it was a new toy. And I'm a geek. I like playing with toys. And I had this new toy, and I said, okay, I've got a new hammer. I got to go find some nails. I got to go find different ways that I can enforce, that I can use Azure Multi-Factor Auth. Some of my use cases worked. Some of my use cases didn't. And as we went from use case to use case and figuring out, yeah, it works really well in this case, it doesn't quite work so well in that case, we kind of boiled down the reasons why to what I now call the immutable laws of multi-factor authentication. First one, the user must always expect the challenge. So you've seen multi-factor auth demos throughout this week, and what does the experience look like? You go to the website, you punch in your username and password, oh, hey, my phone's ringing, let me do the thing, and then I get authenticated. What if your phone just rang out of nowhere? Hey, this is Azure MFA, please allow this authentication to go through. Is that necessary? Number one, it's a bad experience. Number two, it actually cuts down on the security value of the service. And now where we figured this out and where we came across this was we did a little proof of concept of Azure Multi-Factor Auth as the strong authentication for direct access. For those of you who aren't familiar with direct access, it is an auto-reconnecting VPN feature. So, for example, you're sitting on a commuter train, you're direct accessed in, typing away, you go through a tunnel, your connection drops, you come out of the tunnel, the connection comes back up, your secure connection to CorpNet gets automatically reestablished for you in the background. Except if you've integrated with multi-factor auth, it doesn't get automatically reestablished for you in the background. You come back up out of the tunnel, and your phone rings, because we need strong auth to reestablish that connection. The challenge here and the danger here is if the user doesn't expect the challenge, how do they know if it's legitimate? If the user doesn't expect the challenge, what if you're just training them to automatically succeed it? You've just defeated the purpose of strong authentication. So multi-factor auth for direct access didn't quite work out for us. Another case that wasn't necessarily a perfect fit was we were looking at using multi-factor auth for my data center operators. I've got a bunch of guys working shifts in my data center who run around closing help tickets on servers every day, and they close hundreds of tickets every day. In fact, our data center is effectively, our business model for our data centers is how cheaply can we close X number of tickets per day. And so the challenge for our data center operators was, I don't want to put them in a position where they have to answer 800 cell phone calls a day. Number one, it will annoy them. Number two, it will possibly cost them money because, you know, $1 here and $1 here and $1 here and $1 there. It's eventually going to start adding up over time. And even worse than that, from a security perspective, if your phone is ringing all day long, what are you going to start doing? Ring, answer, ring, answer, ring, answer, without even thinking about it. And all I need is one attacker to throw in one spurious request somewhere in the chain, and you didn't even notice it. So, multiple requests all in a row, bad thing. Don't really want to do that. This third one, this is kind of the fun one for me, because, well, I got to embarrass myself in front of a room full of people, and I share my pain so that you don't have to go through it yourselves. Primary versus step-up authentication. What do I mean by that? Azure Multi-Factor Auth is a really fantastic mechanism for step-up authentication, which is to say it's a really good means of providing a second form of authentication once I already know who you are. And so again, you've seen the multi-factor auth demos this week. I enter my username and password. Hey, I've just established who I am. And now my phone rings, providing that second factor of auth. Here's an example where where I learned this, much to my chagrin. Self-service password reset. Our number one help desk call driver from an identity perspective is password resets. So we have a self-service password reset tool in place, but prior to the introduction of Azure MFA, it only allowed self-service password reset on the basis of a physical smart card. So you had to swipe your physical smart card, punch in the PIN, and that would allow you to then reset your Active Directory password, which worked really well if you were a full-time employee. If you were a vendor, it did not work out so well for you, because by default, we do not issue smart cards to our vendors. We issue them to vendors on an exception basis once they've demonstrated business need. So we had thousands of vendors, 8,000 vendors a month, would call our global help desk needing to have their password reset because this was the only option available to them. Hey, Azure MFA, hammer, nail, let me go solve this problem. Let's do self-service password reset with Azure MFA. And at the time, the cloud service wasn't there yet, so I went off and built my own. And I was really proud of it because, you know, I did like usability studies and let's make the site look really good and let's make the user experience look really good. And then I got to demo it to a bunch of people inside of my team. And I said, here's the self-service password reset gate. You see, you go to the self-service password portal and here's this box. And in this box, you type in your username, Contoso Whack L Hunter, and then you click next. And then it goes out and it says, hey, Contoso L Hunter is registered for Azure MFA. Let me go ping her cell phone. And then you ping the cell phone, and hey, now I'm in, and now I can reset my password. Has anyone figured out where this falls down? Oh, this is great. So I'm demoing this thing, and I'm all excited, and I'm talking about the design decisions and why we did this color instead of that color, and why we put the button there instead of there, and I was really getting into it, and then out of nowhere, my phone rang out of my back pocket. Because one of my coworkers, who had been sitting there kind of like this, and I should have known I was in trouble, but I just kept going, one of my coworkers squinted until he could see the URL of my test server and went out to the test server and typed in Contoso Whack L Hunter and clicked next. And that was all that was needed to ring my phone. Doesn't that sound really obvious in retrospect? Yeah, I totally blew that play. The good news is that I blew that play in front of a room full of my peers rather than, say, releasing the service and having it show up on CNN. Oh boy. So I share these pains so that you don't go through them yourselves. The good news is you don't have to go through them yourselves today because now there's a cloud service. And the cloud service took learnings such as that one, like that specific learning of mine, so that for password reset using Azure MFA, we use different mechanisms to assert your identity without your password. And there's a couple of different ways we can do it. We can send an email challenge to a secondary email address. Like you can go and pre-register like your Hotmail account, and it'll send a challenge to your email address. There's a couple of different mechanisms to do it. Point being, I need to have a reasonable certainty that you are who you say you are before I ring your phone. Otherwise, you will be standing in front of a room full of your peers and your phone will ring in your back pocket and you'll look down and you'll go, oh, yeah. And it just occurred to me in that moment. And I just sort of went, shoot. Only I didn't say shoot. Here's some other fun stuff. So again, on the track of got a hammer, got to go find some nails. One of the other areas of the company that we realized we needed to find a way to provide security for were all of these third-party SaaS applications that aren't, from a technical perspective, under IT's control, but that are still very important to the organization and potentially damaging to the organization. I mean, you see on the news every day, so-and-so's company's Twitter account got hacked by, this electronic army or that electronic army, and all these horrible, tweets get posted, and this is actual palpable damage to a company. This is damage to a company's reputation. The challenge with securing these things, though, is that things like Twitter, things like Facebook, things like LinkedIn, the social media assets, these things are username and password based. I would so love for them to support federated auth, and I would love for there to be a, Twitter for enterprises that has a SAML endpoint. God, I would love that day. But at least today, that doesn't exist. So we have, I'm sure some of you have also seen this week, demos of the Access Panel that's in Azure AD Premium. And this is a panel that allows you to assign SaaS applications to different users and to different groups within your organization. It also allows you to, for purpose of password SSO-based applications, the Twitters, the Facebooks, it allows you to pre-populate the credentials. Now, first time someone showed me this, first time one of the guys in the AAD group, in the Azure AD group showed this to me, and they said, Laura, we built this, and we think it's awesome, and we think it's going to provide a lot of value to you. What do you think? My first reaction was not the one they wanted me to have. My first reaction, because I'm an identity lady, my first reaction was, isn't that just a password vault? God, I don't want that. Kill it with fire. I had to get over myself, which is to say that I had to recognize that I'm still the IT person. I have to live in the world as it is, not just hope for the world as I wish it would be. I would love for things like the FIDO Alliance to drastically succeed, and there's no more passwords anywhere ever, and everyone uses federated auth, and we all go home happy. Yeah, that's not the world that I live in today. And so a tool like the Access Panel allows me to provide additional layers of security over my SaaS applications that still, for better or worse, require username and password authentication. What are the things I can do here? I can do things like pre-configuring and pre-populating account credentials into the Access Panel so that I'm not emailing that Twitter account username and password out to 27 different vendors. I can do things like enforce strong authentication to the Access Panel. So before you can even get to the Access Panel, you need to strong auth. You need to use your smart card, or you need to use your Azure MFA. Now, are these perfect mechanisms. Are these perfect protections? No, absolutely not, because a determined attacker is going to sit there with the packet sniffer open and it's going to go look for things as it goes across the wire. But it's going to cut down on pulling a number out of thin air. It's going to cut down on 85% of my security exposure, because how many of my social media vendors can even spell Fiddler, let alone use it to go snatch a password? I'm not going to allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good, is really what this came down to. And using something like the access panel to control and to better secure my social media assets became a really exceptional, stepwise security improvement for us. Now, things that happen as you're deploying the access panel, things that you think about as you're deploying the access panel. The first one I kind of already alluded to, which is, how do you authenticate to the access panel? Do you allow your users to 1FA to the access panel, or do you allow your users to 2FA to the access panel? Laura Hunter's personal opinion: if you are going to be publishing password SSO applications into the access panel, you should require two-factor auth into the access panel. Because otherwise, what happens? Someone compromises my AD username and password, and the first thing they're going to do is go to myapps.azure.com and say, hey, what Twitter accounts has Laura been pre-populated for? So, for my money, because password SSO still exists as a technology and as a call it the necessary evil we need to deal with, if I am going to publish password-based SSO applications into the access panel, I'm going to require two-factor auth. Maybe I only do two-factor auth from the internet because, again, by policy, my company is, my company's security policies are, if you're sitting on CorpNet, we assume strong auth. We assume access to secure prem. So just kind of keeping that on par with your other existing 2FA policies, I think, is kind of the thing to keep in mind. The other thing, and this is kind of the interesting one, is for these password-based SSO applications, for the LinkedIns and the Facebooks and the Twitters, it becomes a question of having not just the technical conversation, but the business conversation, which is to say that you got to go find all these people that have all these different Twitter accounts. I happen to be very lucky because we have this dedicated content marketing group within Microsoft that manages a lot of them, but it's certainly not all of them. And sometimes you have to go and find these people, and you have to go have the conversation with them of, yes, I'm asking you to give up maybe a little bit of control. Maybe I'm asking you to check your Twitter password into the access panel so that the access panel can change that password on your behalf, and it can start rolling that password on your behalf once a month, once a week, once however often. And it ends up being as much a human conversation as anything else. A really good example of this is Alex Simons, who is the Director of Project Management for the Azure AD team. He tweets as @Alex_A_Simons. If you are on the Twitter machine and you do not follow him, you should. Sidebar. Anyone who looks at the name of that Twitter account is going to say, that is Alex's personal Twitter account. Just from the name of it, it's kind of a no-brainer. Go look at his feed. Go look at what he does and how he uses that Twitter feed. He posts product announcements. He interacts with the media. He interacts with analysts. That is absolutely, at least for now, a corporate asset. And I want to be able to protect it as though it's a corporate asset. Now, maybe someday in the great by and by, Alex leaves us and wants to take back control of his Alex_A_Simons Twitter account, and I need to create mechanisms to allow him to do that. But these different assets and these different social media presences that are being leveraged to act as Microsoft on behalf of Microsoft, these are valid targets, I think, for a protection mechanism such as the access panel. And it does become as much about talking to the humans as it is about clicking the buttons and playing with the technology, even though we know playing with the technology is the fun part. Speaking of the humans, probably the most interesting part about turning up two-factor authentication, starting at the beginning of this calendar year, was that if you think about 2FA, the hint is kind of in the name. We're prompting you twice. You are, in effect, asking your users to eat their vegetables. We're going to make it better for you. We're going to make it a better experience for you. We're going to give you things like Azure MFA. We're going to do things like integration with Intune so that if you've registered your device with Intune and we can assert that this is a trusted and a healthy device, you're not going to get prompted for 2FA. Maybe you only get prompted once every 5 days, or maybe you only get prompted like, once every other week or once a month. But the very simple fact of the matter is that implementing strong authentication, implementing 2FA, is going to change your user's experience if you're not using it today. From a human perspective, from a business perspective, from a process perspective, this is why a 2FA initiative, particularly one that needs to go very broad and or very fast, for my money, this sort of initiative cannot be initiated by the IT people. It cannot be initiated by the guy in IT flipping the button to turn on 2FA. It needs to have buy-in and sponsorship from your business leadership. You need to have sponsorship and cooperation from your business team and from your business leadership who understand, yes, this is super important, and yes, this may cause a couple of headaches, and yes, this may cause a couple of people to complain, but hey, IT, I, business leader, back you. And when the bleepity bleep hits the fan, I'm going to be standing next to you, explaining along with you why this is important. And when you start deploying 2FA, when you start rolling out 2FA, don't make your life harder than it needs to be, I think is kind of the best way to express it, which is to say, not everyone's going to like it to start. So start with those portions of the business that are more amenable to it than others. Start with your friends, I think is a good way to put it. In Microsoft IT's case, I had no better friend than my operating systems division. I think I still have Nellie in the room somewhere. She was like my biggest supporter as we went to roll this out, because we sat with a leader in the operating systems group, and it was like this light bulb flashed on. He said, wait a minute, are you telling me that I can require all of my developers to use strong authentication anytime they check in code from an untrusted network? I believe his response was literally verbatim, "Aw, hell yeah." Start with your friends. Start with your friends. Start with audiences who are amenable to the process. Start with audiences for whom you have that kind of leadership backing. Roll it out to them. Let them live with it for a month. And then you get to go to other parts of your organization and you get to say things like, well, OSG's been doing this for a month and they're okay. It's as much about the humans as it is about anything else, I think is kind of the way that I sum it up. So I realize that I am the last session of the day. I am amazed that you have not all just ran screaming for the airport by now. I thank you so much for coming. If you like this little, hour-long story time with Laura, we have all kinds of other resources from various other parts of Microsoft IT. Go talk to the Exchange guys. They'll tell you how much fun it is to deploy the next versions of Microsoft Exchange. Go talk to our client guys. They can tell you how we're rolling out tens of thousands of new client images every week as we're working on the new versions of the Windows client. Please fill out your evaluation. I realize it's the end of the day, but if you can do that one last thing for me before you go to the airport, that would be really awesome. If you liked what you heard, please tell them. If you didn't like what you heard, please tell me, and we'll try to fix it for you. We've got about 10 minutes left, but again, it's the last session of the day, so I'm just going to hang out until people feel like leaving. So if you have other questions for me, come see me up here, and enjoy the rest of your Friday. Have wonderful flights or drives or trains, planes, automobiles, home to wherever you're going. Thank you very much.